Okay, good morning, Shavua Tov. This week is the Parsha of Eikev. The Parsha discusses the reward when we fulfill and observe the mitzvahs of Hashem. And then Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu about the time when they will enter Eretz Yisrael. They should be very careful with all this moral and spiritual pitfalls that they will encounter, with all the kings and the nations that will introduce their idolatry, their immorality. And thus we should not covet the gold and the silver which will be used for idol worship. And after that, it says the following. The pasuk in chapter 8, pasuk number 1, it says, Kol ha-mitzvah. We'll explain in a moment exactly what that means, but Kol ha-mitzvah, let's for now translate as all of the mitzvos, Ashar nochi mitzavcha yom, which Hashem says that I am commanding you today, Tishmerun lasois, you should observe, Laman tichyun, in order that you should live, Uravisem, and you will multiply, Uvasem v'yirishtem es haaretz, you shall enter and inherit the land, Asher nishba Hashem lavaseichem, which Hashem has given an oath and a covenant to your ancestors. So today we are going to analyze just the first two words of the pasuk, Kol ha-mitzvah. So there's various explanations exactly what mitzvah we are referring to over here. Kol ha-mitzvah, we will start with the explanation of Rashi. Rashi gives two explanations. When he brings the words Kol ha-mitzvah, his first explanation is kipshuto, the literal, simple explanation, which would seem to mean Kol ha-mitzvah means all of the mitzvahs. And then he gives a second interpretation. And he says that this is a midrashic, homiletical explanation, which is, if you have started with a mitzvah, you should complete it. Because a mitzvah is only accredited and ascribed to the one who completes it. And he brings a verse as a proof from Joshua, from Yoshua, which says that it refers to the remains of Yosef, which the Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people, had brought up from Mitzrayim, and they interred Yosef in Shechem. Now it seems strange to associate the burial of Yosef and the fact that he was brought up from Mitzrayim, as we know that Yosef, he passed away in Mitzrayim and he requested that he should be buried in Israel. Seemingly we know that Moshe Rabbeinu was the one that brought Yosef up from Mitzrayim and he carried him throughout the desert for 40 years. So why do we say that it was the Jewish people in general? Because Moshe Rabbeinu did not have the opportunity to bring him into Israel and to finish the job because he passed away. He didn't make it in. And therefore, in the end, who brought Yosef into Eretz Yisrael? Who buried him? It was the Jewish people at large. And therefore, the mitzvah is associated with them. That's basically what Rashi says. And the Rebbe, when he discusses this Rashi, it prompts a number of questions. Number one, in general, Rashi, when he gives a comment, he only explains something that necessitates explanation. So what exactly was bothering Rashi? The Torah says, Kol ha-mitzvah, all of the mitzvahs that I command you to do, you should fulfill them, and in order that you should be able to enter Eretz Yisrael. What's the problem over here? And if you are going to give an explanation, seemingly there's other explanations. There's the explanation of the Chizkuni, the 13th century commentator, who says that the mitzvah that we are referring to over here is the mitzvah that we were just discussing earlier in the previous verse. As we mentioned, the mitzvah that Hashem is encouraging them to stay away from idol worship. So therefore, it would actually make sense to call it Kol ha-mitzvah, even though it's a single mitzvah, because we know that avodah zarah, idolatry, is equivalent in its severity to the entire of the Torah. And one who abstains from idol worship, it's as if he has fulfilled all of the mitzvahs. Why does Rashi not elect to use that explanation? And he has to give a different explanation. He has to give two explanations. And also, the whole what Rashi brings about the story in the second explanation. If you start a mitzvah, you should fulfill it. And a mitzvah is only ascribed to the person who completes it, and he brings a proof. Seemingly, there's a lot of elaboration, a lot of discussion in Rashi, who is usually very concise and to the point. Why does he need to bring, if you want to tell us that a person does a mitzvah, he should fulfill it, he should do kol ha-mitzvah, he should do the entire mitzvah, why does he need to explain about a person who begins a mitzvah, a person who completes the mitzvah, he takes all the credit, he has to bring a proof from Yosef, why is that relevant? And this whole Rashi needs further explanation. So there are some that say that what bothers Rashi is the Torah says kol ha-mitzvah. Now the problem, what Rashi is struggling with is the grammar, because kol, the word kol means all, every. Mitzvah should have then been in a plural, written in a plural form. Why was it written ha-mitzvah, which is written as a singular? If it's all, then it should be kol ha-mitzvahs. That's what the Bartanura, other commentators on Rashi explain what was bothering him. The Rebbe rejects that contention because we find other places where the Torah says kol ha-mitzvah, and Rashi does not explain anything. He doesn't in any way bring explanations. What does kol ha-mitzvah mean? So clearly, for Rashi, the word kol ha-mitzvah in itself doesn't bother us. The fact that it didn't write mitzvos. Just like you would say fish or sheep, you could use that, it's the word that we use, and it refers to many. So mitzvah could refer to many, many mitzvahs. So we need an explanation to understand what was bothering Rashi. So what we have here is what the Rebbe explains. Why did Rashi, first we have to establish why did Rashi reject the interpretation of the Chizkuni. As we mentioned, the Chizkuni says that when the Torah says kol ha-mitzvah, all of the mitzvahs, it's referring to idol worship. So the Rebbe explains the reason why Rashi rejected this interpretation is because when the Torah describes in the previous psukim about the necessity to reject idol worship, it's clearly referring to a time when they're already in Eretz Yisrael. As the Torah describes, when you will enter the land and you will conquer the kings and the nations, you should not be swayed and you should not in any way be seduced by their ideology, by their religions, by their pagan worship. So clearly we're talking about a time where the Jewish people are already in Israel. And in that instance, in that scenario, they should make sure to abstain and reject and in fact destroy idols. However, in our pasuk, it's very clear that we're talking about a period of time that is prior, it is before the time they entered Israel. As it says over here, that Hashem is telling them, all of the kol ha-mitzvah, all of the mitzvahs that you will fulfill, when you will fulfill them and observe them, then, laman, it is in order that you should be able to enter the land and multiply and inherit the land that you're going to have. So clearly we're talking about the mitzvahs that you're going to observe prior to their entry. So clearly from Rashi's perspective, we cannot be referring to idol worship. So if that is the case, which mitzvahs is the Torah referring to? So the struggle that Rashi has at this point is because on the one hand, it says kol ha-mitzvah. Kol ha-mitzvah seems to imply all of the mitzvahs. And yet, which period of time are we referring to? It is Rosh Chodesh Shvat that Moshe Rabbeinu has begun to review the entire Torah. So right now, we are at least from Rosh Chodesh Shvat, perhaps a little bit later. And when did they enter the land of Israel? In Nisan. only 2 months and a couple days later. So in a short period of time, Moshe Rabbeinu is telling them that you should fulfill all of these mitzvahs in order that you should enter Eretz Yisrael. But seemingly, it is impossible for them to fulfill all of the mitzvahs, all 613. Number one, there are many, many mitzvahs that are specifically associated and hinge on Eretz Yisrael. Then there are many holidays between Shvat and Nisan. There are no Yom Tovim. So there's literally a handful of mitzvahs that the Jewish people could theoretically, conceivably fulfill and observe during the short period of time. And yet, Moshe Rabbeinu is saying, Kol ha-mitzvah, all of the mitzvahs, you should fulfill in order to enter Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, Rashi needs to explain, how is it possible they could observe all the mitzvahs? So therefore, the first explanation of Rashi is, Kol ha-mitzvah is kipshuto. Indeed, they cannot fulfill all 613. However, what we're saying is, Kol ha-mitzvah refers to a group. Fulfill all of the mitzvahs that are possible, that are at least something that's within reach at that time. Any mitzvah that you can do, that's what you should fulfill. That's the first explanation. However, this explanation is, as we mentioned, is a bit tenuous, as at the end of the day, if we're going to say fulfill all the mitzvahs, why say kol ha-mitzvahs, fulfill all the mitzvahs if you can't fulfill all of them? Rashi wants to bring a second explanation. His second explanation is, if you fulfill a mitzvah, complete it. Here what the Torah is saying, kol ha-mitzvah is not all of the mitzvahs, but kol ha-mitzvah, the entirety of a certain mitzvah. The Torah is intimating that if you begin a mitzvah, complete it. Complete kol ha-mitzvah, the entire mitzvah. There's something profound here, that if you have an opportunity to do a mitzvah, make sure to see it through until the end. So far, that makes sense. But Rashi decides to continue with a whole discussion that if you begin a mitzvah, make sure to complete it. He brings a proof from Yosef. Why was that all of that relevant? So the Rebbe gives us an interesting perspective. And that is, if we think about it, why indeed, or how, were the Bnei Yisrael meriting to enter Israel? So we know that already from the Bris Ben Absarim, from the covenant of parts, Hashem promised them that they will have a land. He promised it to Avram as part of the covenant. So it was indeed ours. But yet we find throughout history that not everyone merited to enter. The story of the Meraglim, others, they were banned. They were prohibited from entering Eretz Yisrael. So the question is, why? If Hashem promised it to us, there was an oath, there was a covenant, why did they not enter? So one of the ideas here is, we see clearly that entering Eretz Yisrael is certainly a right of every single Jew, was promised to us. However, there are certain things that could preclude us from entering, which means even though Hashem made a promise, that's in general that the Jewish people will enter. However, the question is who, precisely, and when. So we see that the Meraglim, by virtue of their actions, even though for many, many years they did their mitzvahs, they did what they had to do, when it came to a critical time and they discouraged the Bnei Yisrael from going in and gave their evil and negative report, they forfeited their chance to enter. So merely what happened was the promise that was given to them was suspended and transferred to the next generation. So what we see from here is that in addition to the promise, to the oath that we all had, guaranteeing us the land of Israel, we have to fulfill and obey all of the commandments that Hashem gives us. And in that merit, that specific generation is merit to enter Eretz Yisrael. If that is the case, in this pasuk, Moshe Rabbeinu is telling them, indeed, you have merited, you have been promised to enter Eretz Yisrael. However, it is in the merit, it's specifically due to the mitzvahs that you will fulfill that you will enter. So the question is, seemingly, how did they fulfill all the mitzvahs? As we mentioned, it's only a couple months between now and going into Eretz Yisrael. This was a young generation. They haven't fulfilled many, many mitzvahs. So on what basis are they entering? So Moshe Rabbeinu is telling them that what you have here is, in addition to the mitzvahs that you fulfilled, there are mitzvahs that have been accumulating for 40 years, even from the previous generation. All the mitzvahs that your parents, even though they have passed on, it is the cumulative effect of all the mitzvahs that they've done, in addition to what you're doing now. That is the merit as to why you're going to enter. But you're going to say, hang on, it's not fair. The previous generation, they observed many, many, many mitzvahs. And now, it is the next generation, they're going to take all of that, and based on that, they're going to merit to enter Israel. So on this, Rashi tells us, there's a principle. We know that when a person completes a mitzvah, even though they have not initiated, it is accredited to them. So that means even though the previous generation fulfilled all of these mitzvahs, the credit goes to this last generation who entered Eretz Yisrael. And all of the work and effort that was done previously is associated to them. Which is very, very interesting. Because amongst the people who performed the mitzvahs in that previous generation, you had the Meraglim. You had those who did not want to enter Eretz Yisrael. But then there was also people who were actually decent, good people who did not sin. But yet there was a general decree on that entire generation, anyone who was between the ages of 20 and 60, that they would perish. So you had those who actually fulfilled mitzvahs. You had those who really wanted to go, but there was a decree on all of them that they couldn't enter. So the question is, we understand the Meraglim, we understand those who were opposed to entering Israel. We understand why their mitzvahs are transferred and credited to this next generation. But what about those who were good, were decent, were pious, they wanted to enter Israel? It is not their fault that they couldn't enter. Conversely, you had another phenomenon. You had those who did not want to enter Israel. They were opposed to it, but they were younger than 20. If they were younger than 20, the decree did not apply to them. So you'd have an interesting concept where those who were younger than 20 during the sin of the Meraglim, they grew up, they actually merited to enter Israel. They collected the credit of the mitzvahs of the previous generation. So you had some who wanted to enter Israel and they didn't, and the mitzvahs are not credited to them. You had those who didn't want to enter Israel, but because of their age, when they subsequently grew up, they took credit for the mitzvahs and did enter Israel. How is that fair? How does that make any sense? That's why Rashi, he brings a proof from Moshe Rabbeinu. In the instance of Moshe Rabbeinu, he alone was busy, preoccupied with carrying the remains of Yosef from Mitzrayim, and he traveled with them throughout the 40 years in the desert. He wanted to bring Yosef to the final resting stop, which was in Shechem. But he did not get the opportunity. Because of a decree, he ended up passing in the Midbar, and he did not go in. So he couldn't see the job through until the end. So Rashi says we see from this story, and the way Yehoshua, when he mentions the burial of Yosef, who gets the credit? He says it's the Jewish people carried Yosef from Mitzrayim and brought him to Israel. Moshe Rabbeinu is not mentioned here at all. Even though he was schlepping and working for all of those years, he gets no mention, he gets no credit. Because at the end of the day, and why did he not get the credit? It's not as if at some point he said, I'm not doing this, I'm done, I'm too tired, I can't do this anymore. It was beyond it was beyond anything that he could do. He couldn't stop it. It was decreed by Hashem. You couldn't fault him. And yet, he does not get the credit. So what do we see from here? That it doesn't make a difference what you wanted to do or what you didn't want to do. The question is, what happened in the end? Even if it was an accident, a situation that was beyond your control. At the end of the day, if you complete the mitzvah, you get the credit. Even if previously you didn't want it to happen, just like those who were younger than 20 didn't want to enter Israel, the fact of the matter is, since they were in the right place in the right time, they got the credit. And conversely, those who were in the desert, but because they were good and they wanted to enter Israel, but they got swept up in the decree, at the end of the day, they did not get the credit for the mitzvah. So this is a fascinating phenomenon we have from all of this. That the way the Torah tells us to look at something, sometimes we have the best of intentions. And we begin something, we begin a project, we begin a mitzvah. But something comes along and we lose the opportunity to see it through. You have someone else who sees that opportunity, is able to capitalize on it and complete it. There's the execution of the project. That is the person that gets all the credit. However, Rashi brings these two dimensions here. On the one hand, he says, if you are able and if you have begun to perform a mitzvah, complete it, see it all the way to the end. And then he says, the mitzvah is ascribed to the person who completes it. So, on the one hand, he seems to say that you should complete the mitzvah. That's an obligation, it's a duty. If you have begun a mitzvah, do it. But on the other hand, he says, that the mitzvah is credited to one who does it, which seems to just be a suggestion. It's a nice thing, you get the credit. But what Rashi is telling here is two profound ideas. Number one, what he's telling us is that if you have begun a mitzvah, complete it. Which means to say, even if you begin something and then you realize you can't complete it. So you may say, what's the point? Or you may not even begin in the first instance because you'll say, what's the point of starting if I can't complete it? Rashi says, no. If you have an opportunity, you should seize it. You should do the mitzvah. Even if you know you may not, or you know for sure you won't complete it. We just learned last week an example of Moshe Rabbeinu and the Ari Miklat, the cities of refuge. The cities of refuge, where there were 3 cities and shelters in Eretz Yisrael proper, and then there were 3 which were on the east side of the Jordan, which became part of the Eretz Yisrael. And these cities only became functional, which they sheltered those who were fleeing from a person who was chasing them in a case of an unintentional murder. And yet, these cities only became functional once they entered Eretz Yisrael. But Moshe Rabbeinu decided to designate the 3 in the Transjordan on the east side of the Yarden. Moshe Rabbeinu designates these 3 cities. And even though he knew he's not entering Israel, he knew that he couldn't dedicate the other 3, and these 3 would not begin to become activated and functional until the other 3 were designated, which would happen years later. Only after they conquered the land, they divided it. Moshe Rabbeinu says, since I have an opportunity to do a mitzvah, I will fulfill it. I will complete it. Even though it was only the initiation, it was only the beginning of the mitzvah, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't pass up that opportunity. So going back to Kol HaMitzvah, Moshe Rabbeinu is telling the Jewish people like this: you are about to enter Israel. I am telling you that it's all because of Kol HaMitzvah. You right now have the opportunity to complete the efforts the mitzvahs, the good deeds that have been collecting for all of these years. I am telling you that it is in the merit of all of those deeds you will now enter. Because what you're going to do now is kol ha-mitzvah. You're going to do the entirety of all of the mitzvahs that were done together. With your effort, you will complete that. And therefore, the mitzvah will be associated with you. And it is in that merit you will enter. So what we have here is two, and soon we'll mention a third important principles which should guide us in our lives. Number one, sometimes we wonder. It seems unfair and it seems illogical that we are in the position that we are. In the year 2020, we don't see the leadership, we don't see the righteousness, the piety that we've seen in previous generations. The level of scholarship, the level of spiritual and moral caliber that we read about previous generations, certainly going back many, many years. And we wonder, how is it possible that we know that the Talmud tells us there are certain signs, there are certain indicators as to when Mashiach will be coming. We are in a period that's known as Ikvasa de Mashiach. Ikvasa de Mashiach, Ikvasa is the heel. Like this name of the parsha, Eikev, which means we are literally at the threshold with all that's going on in this world. Things are shaking up. And as topsy-turvy and as crazy as things may seem, they are actually signs of the imminent arrival of Mashiach. And it seems very, very strange. And it almost seems hard to comprehend that it is in our generation we will bring Mashiach. Because how is it possible? Avram Avinu, Moshe Rabbeinu, some of the greatest giants, the Tanaim, the Amoraim, the Rambam, and Rashi, and you go through the Arizal and subsequent generations, the Chabad Rebbes, all accomplished so much. They were such great spiritual giants. But in their generation, Mashiach didn't come. And yet we are suggesting that it is in our generation, which surely there are many, many great people, but perhaps some of them are hidden, they're concealed from us. How is it possible that it is in our generation we are going to accomplish something that was never done before? We are going to bring Mashiach. And sometimes that meditation, that reflection could paralyze us and say, who do we think we are? How is it possible that we should have the audacity, we should have the chutzpah, that we are going to be the ones that are going to push it finally across the finish line? We're going to bring Mashiach. So this is something the Rebbe spoke many, many times. He touches upon it in this sikha as well. And one of the ideas he spoke about was the concept of the metaphor of the dwarf on the shoulders of a giant, where you have someone who's very, very small, and their field of vision is very, very narrow and limited. But yet, when they are placed upon the shoulders of a giant, they can see very, very far. In fact, they can see farther than the giant himself can see. The Rebbe once mentioned the story of the Rebbe Menachem Mendel of Haraduk. It was on Simchas Torah, and the Hasidim, they were waiting for him to come out for the Hakafos. And as time goes on, the Hasidim began to become impatient, and then they became worried. Where's the Rebbe? So they sent in the Alter Rebbe, who was a colleague and a disciple as well. They studied by the Maggid together. Perhaps he would be able to speak to him and see what was going on. And as he goes into Rabbi Menachem Mendel, he says, what's going on? We have to go out. And Rabbi Menachem Mendel says that, well, I've begun to reflect and meditate on the Ata Haresa, which is the verses that we recite at the Hakafas, and I came to realize that there are 100 interpretations, spiritual dimensions and levels to this. And it's overwhelming. And I need to meditate and reflect and ponder on all of that before we go out to dance with the Torah. So the Alter Rebbe told him that there is a principle that as far as a person could see, it is impossible for a person to be where they can see. Which means if you can see something, whether it's physically or spiritually, something that's very, very far, it's impossible to reach that level. Because the moment you're going to reach that level or that place, you will see something that is also equally as far. And thus he said, you see right now 100 interpretations. Once you have studied and analyzed and reflected upon those 100 levels, you'll come to the realization that there are another 100 levels. In other words, Hashem is infinite. And as much as you see and understand, once you get to that level which you strive for, you'll realize there's something even more infinite, even more limitless than you could have imagined. So let's go out to Hakafas. And when Reb Mendel heard that, he said he agreed, and they went out to the Hakafas. But we see from here is that sometimes where we stand in life, we see things, but really it seems to be way out of our reach, way beyond us. It is only with the help of standing on the giant's shoulders we are catapulted to a level that we on our own right would never be able to achieve or to reach. So what we have is the fact that we are here at the time of Mashiach. It's not because of our own efforts. It's not because of our own greatness necessarily. Rather, it is because we are standing on the shoulders of the giants of history. And the Rebbe once added another dimension, which is that ultimately, when we look at history, we should not look at it as each year, each decade, each century or millennia is self-contained. To look at each era as something that is isolated from the events that happened before it and after it. Rather, we have to look at all of history as one big book, as one entity. Because if we look at things from a perspective of evil, negativity, it has no true existence. It cannot last. Whatever we see is ultimately something that is not true. But good, something that's positive, it is real. And it's something that once it happened, it is always there. So therefore, we look at the collective of history as all of our ancestors, all of our heroes, all the people, the role models we look up to. These are people that are still here with us. And therefore, all of the deeds that they've done are all associated, all connected to each other. And therefore, the Mesiras Nefesh, the sacrifice that our parents, our grandparents, everything that they gave up for is not something that just happened at that time and it dissipates. In fact, it is still there. And it inspires us still today. So, the sacrifice that our ancestors had, whether it was in Spain, whether it was in Poland, whether it was in America, wherever it may have been. It could have been in Eretz Yisrael, it could have been during the Churban. All of these events that happened are all connected because the Jewish people constitute one body, one essence, not just today, but throughout history. We are all linked in the chain that goes back many, many generations. And therefore, we know the famous words of the Rambam. Maimonides tells us that each person should look at the world as a scale, that is evenly balanced. There's good on the one side, there's the opposite on the other side. And it is one deed, it is one action that we commit to, that we observe, will tip the scale for good. The Rebbe says, how do we understand that? How could the deeds of one person tip the cosmic scale and bring healing and redemption and salvation to the entire world? The answer is because all of these efforts are coming together on the scale where all the good deeds and all of the learning and all the prayers have been collecting, have been accumulating for many, many years. And therefore, all of those efforts, if we just do one little positive good thing, that is why the scale will tip. Because we are all connected to the deeds, to the sacrifice, to the kindness, to the generosity that we've seen throughout the generations. That is why our little deed will ultimately tip the scale. I read a story about how a Chabad rabbi, he went to go visit a fellow person from his community who was in the hospital and was getting on. And this person was a Holocaust survivor. And he was telling him, he realized he only had a few moments left in this world. And he started telling him what his mother said to him years earlier, the night before they were separated. She said to him, his name was Srolik. Srolik, I want to tell you something that you should remember for the rest of your life. You should know that life, he said his mother was very much into the arts. She would go to theater a lot. She said, you should know that life is like a play. In a play, everyone plays their part. Everyone has their specific role. You should know that our parents, our grandparents, they were all part of this play. They acted out their role, and when they were finished, they went backstage. However, they did not walk away. They didn't disappear. They stood behind the curtain and watched how their children, how their siblings, their relatives continued to do their part. So his mother says, I want you to know that you too have a role to play. You still have a part that you need to contribute. And she said, I don't know what's going to be, what the future holds. However, when the time comes, it may seem difficult, it may seem challenging, you may feel sad. I want you, no matter what, to make sure to fulfill and play your part. And remember, if you feel lonely, if you feel alone, you should know that we are all there watching you behind the curtain, encouraging you, cheering for you to playing your part. And that was the last thing she told him. And he said the next day they were separated and he never saw her again. Those were the last words that this Holocaust survivor said. And a short while later he passed on. And this Chabad rabbi said that at the Shiva, the family, they were speaking about this, how it was really a source of encouragement, and to know that their father was still there, even though he passed on. He was, so to speak, behind the curtain, watching them, encouraging them, and that was a tremendous source of comfort and consolation. So the rabbi said, I want you to know, there's another point here as well, that after the play, what happens is everyone, all the actors, all the participants, the curtain parts, and they all step up and they all take a bow together. I want you to know, each and every one of you, that Mirz Hashem, very soon, Mashiach will come. And all of the players, all of the participants, all the protagonists, they are going to come up to the stage to take the bow together. Very soon we will be reunited with our loved ones, with the coming of Mashiach. It's important to remember this as we stand, as we mentioned, at the threshold of Mashiach, how on the one hand we may feel inconsequential, we may feel small, we may feel powerless, and say, who am I if Moshe Rabbeinu, if the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Shem Tov, in their generation, Mashiach didn't come with all their miracles and all their powers? How is it going to be us? Because they are all there with us. They are all encouraging us. They are cheering us on. It is on their shoulders that we stand. We are connected to that chain. We are taking all of their efforts. And it is in that merit we could bring Mashiach. But, as Rashi says, on the one hand, even though it may seem strange, but since we are the ones that are completing the mitzvah, we are the ones in the right place, in the right time, the credit will go to us. Because there is something special about our generation. If we are able to, despite all the distractions and despite all of the challenges, to be able to persevere, there's a special level of Mesiras Nefesh, of sacrifice that our generation has, that previous generation didn't have. So that's the first principle. Where we are in time, don't think, who am I? What can I do? How could I really change the status? At the end of the day, you take what you have, you complete the mitzvah, and then you get the credit. That's lesson number one. Number two, on the other hand, as Rashi says, you started a mitzvah, make sure to complete it. Which means you have an opportunity to do a mitzvah. You're going to say, it's never going to happen. I'm never going to complete it. Imagine Moshe Rabbeinu, when he looks at these Ari Miklat, he looks at these cities of refuge and say, what's the point? I'm putting the wheels in motion. I'm never going to see it through. You have an opportunity to start something. You should go for it. Don't throw in the towel. And even if you do start, don't stop. Because every generation and every person has their special mission. You know, famously, the Baal Shem Tov, he told his brother-in-law about the encounter he had with Mashiach in the celestial chamber. And he asked him, when is Mashiach going to come? And he says, when you will disseminate the teachings of Chassidus. This is a job that no one had before. In the previous generations, Moshe Rabbeinu and the Rambam, there was Kabbalah, there were mystical teachings, but never was there this special task to go out and teach Chassidus. And yet, sometimes we do. We study a little bit, we teach others, and we feel, okay, we've done something, but we start losing that passion, we start losing that momentum. So we feel perhaps, let someone else do it, let's get some young blood to get involved. We have to know, if you began something, you got to continue. You should not let up. The Rebbe brings the story of the Alter Rebbe, who was imprisoned. As we celebrate the Yom Tov of Yud-Tes Kislev. And at some point during his incarceration, he was visited by the Baal Shem Tov, by the Maggid. And they told him, they informed him, you should know that the reason you're in jail right now is because of a very deep and powerful spiritual opposition to your teaching of Chassidus. And therefore, you've been enjailed because there's an opposition to this whole movement. So the Alter Rebbe asked them, what should I do? At the end, if I'm going to be freed, if I'm going to be liberated, should I continue? Maybe I should slow things down, maybe lay low for a little bit. And what the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid told them is, no, the fact that you have already started, since you have already started, you should continue. And in fact, you should increase. You should teach even more. The Rebbe says what they're telling him is that you began something. You can't just stop. You began something very positive, very powerful, very deep. Don't let go. Continue going. So the lesson from here, on the other hand, is even though the person who completes the mitzvah gets all the credit, At the end of the day, if you have an opportunity, many times people are perfectionists and they say, if I can't finish the job, if I can't see it through, what's the point of starting anyways? Or if they have begun and they feel they did something, they said, okay, it's good. I did something good. Now let's step aside. Let someone else do it. If you have the opportunity to do something good, don't take your foot off the pedal. Continue to do good things, because every single person was given that special opportunity. Who knows? Maybe that is why you were created. This is your mission. This is your destiny. So, in conclusion, we have the pasuk that says, Kol ha-mitzvah. Moshe Rabbeinu is telling the Jewish people, it is in the merit of the mitzvahs that you do that you will enter the land of Eretz Yisrael. It is Kol ha-mitzvah. Do all of the mitzvah. Complete that which was done in the previous generations. Yes, they did much, but Kol ha-mitzvah. We need the entirety of any mitzvah that was done. But on the other hand, Moshe Rabbeinu says, Kol ha-mitzvah, even though it was they who did the mitzvah, you are the ones that are going to be credited with the mitzvah. And due to that, you will enter Eretz Yisrael. So we have the two lessons. Number one, in any instance, in any case where you're able to do a mitzvah, grab that opportunity and don't let up. But on the other hand, wherever you are, never feel small. Never feel inconsequential. You never know. It could be one little deed that you do, one act of kindness, a smile, a very kind gesture. It could bring salvation. It could tip the scale and transform not just your life, but the entire world. So may it be Hashem's will, as we are in the period, in the aftermath of Tisha B'Av, which we just observed this past Shabbos, Nachamu, the consolation, the double consolation, Nachamu, Nachamu. We should each know that it is within the capacity of each and every one of us to do something so powerful, so radical. It's not just Nachamu, Hashem is going to bring us comfort and consolation. It actually is we need to take action. We need to take the bull by the horns. And you never know what deed we do could literally transform the world through a force of good, of positive, and happiness. May it be Hashem's will that we bring Mashiach, as we are in the footsteps of Mashiach, through that mitzvah, Kol ha-mitzvah, any mitzvah that we do, we will ultimately enter Eretz Yisrael, the coming of Mashiach, b'mher of Yameinu, Amen.